Welcome to episode 29A. Today we'll explore how biblical researchers often rely on assumptions rather than concrete evidence in their studies. This approach raises significant questions about the validity of their conclusions. Let's start with the example of Yom Kippur and its omission in Zechariah's list of fasting days. Researchers use this to argue for a later addition of Yom Kippur in the Torah. However, they overlook the context of Zechariah's list, which focuses on fasts related to the temple's destruction and rebuilding, not on Yom Kippur's Torah-mandated observances. This example highlights a trend in biblical research where connections are assumed rather than established through direct evidence. Moving on to Deuteronomy, some researchers suggest a delay in its composition to the monarchy period, citing laws that seem to fit that era's context. Yet this is more speculation than proof, especially when considering the arguments for Deuteronomy's precedence. We often find researchers identifying contradictions where none may exist. Take, for instance, the bronze serpent in Numbers, regarded as a valid symbol, but later seen as idolatry in Kings. This discrepancy points more to the researcher's interpretation than to an inherent contradiction in the texts. The settlement Mizpah is another contentious point. Researchers place Mizpah north of Yabok, basing their argument on a backward reflection of a later covenant. This ignores the evidence suggesting no such reflection in the patriarchal stories, demonstrating a selective use of evidence to support preconceived notions. Another critical issue is whether the laws of the Torah were observed in the prophet's era. Researchers list examples of kings engaging in priestly roles, which they claim deviates from Torah laws. However, a closer look reveals that these examples either fit within the Torah's allowances or involve actions of wicked kings, which cannot be generalized. The topic of linguistic research in biblical studies also shows a tendency toward assumption-based conclusions. Researchers often connect a word in the Bible to a similar word in another ancient language to argue for the lateness of a biblical book. This approach is speculative, as it assumes the earliest known use of a word is its actual first occurrence. Furthermore, the critique extends to the theory that the priestly source was created in the Babylonian exile. Researchers like Kaufman, who refute this theory, face challenges in establishing a concrete historical basis for the creation of the priestly source. This situation underscores the difficulty in linking biblical texts to specific historical contexts based on logical arguments alone. Dr. Meir Farren's skepticism about the originality of the ark's description in Exodus is another instance. He questions why certain details are missing in Deuteronomy, or why the ark was carried on a wagon in Samuel. These points, while intriguing, do not conclusively prove the lack of originality in Exodus's description. They reflect more on the assumptions made by the researcher than on the text itself. In the case of Samuel, researchers question the portrayal of his national leadership role, suggesting it is an unrealistic depiction by a later author. This view neglects the comprehensive evidence throughout the biblical narrative that supports Samuel's wide-reaching influence and leadership. Lastly, linguistic research often relies on identifying similarities between biblical words and those in other ancient languages. While this can provide interesting insights, it does not necessarily determine the composition period of the entire book. The only way to make such a determination would be through a comprehensive analysis of the entire text, which is often avoided in favor of more speculative methods. In conclusion, our exploration in this episode reveals a consistent pattern in biblical research, where assumptions often take precedence over solid evidence. This trend not only affects the interpretation of specific texts, but also raises broader questions about the methodologies used in biblical studies. Thank you for joining us in this episode as we critically examine these aspects of biblical research. Stay tuned for more in-depth discussions in our upcoming episodes.